Movies make medieval battles look like non-stop sword duels and perfect cavalry charges. In real life, most fights were decided by things you barely see on screen. Who could keep an army fed? Who picked the better ground? Who held formation? And who broke first? Let's break down the hidden rules of medieval warfare that shaped real outcomes, and why Hollywood usually gets them wrong. Number 1. Logistics decides who fights. Medieval battles didn't start when the first sword came out. They started when a ruler tried to gather people, animals, and supplies in the same place at the same time. A medieval army was usually a mix. A corps of professionals and household troops, a lot of part-time fighters doing an obligation, hired mercenaries, and support workers who kept everyone moving. Many nobles owed service for a limited period, so commanders watched the clock. If the campaign dragged on, you had to pay men to stay, and money could run out fast. And payment wasn't just wages. You had to cover food, horseshoes, replacement tack, wagon repairs, and sometimes compensation for lost equipment depending on the contract. Even before payment, there was the basic math of food. A man can live on bread, beans, cheese, and whatever you can buy or take locally. Horses are the real problem. A force with many mounted men needs huge amounts of fodder every day, and you can't improvise hay for thousands of animals for long. That's why armies spread out to forage, and why commanders cared about rivers, mills, barns, and market towns. They also cared about roads. Wagons break, wheels sink, bridges collapse, and if your baggage train gets stuck, you don't just lose comfort. You lose arrows, spare gear, tents, and sometimes your pay chest. Marching speeds were usually limited by the slowest parts of the column, not by the fastest knights, by necessity. On a good day, an army might cover something like 15 to 25 kilometers, and bad weather could cut that down hard. Camps had their own rules, too. Pick ground with water, but not so low that it turns into a swamp. Post guards, control fires, keep animals from scattering, and manage sanitation so sickness doesn't wipe out more men than fighting does. So when movies show armies appearing instantly, they're skipping the real contest. Who can arrive fed, organized, and not exhausted? That logistical pressure very often shaped strategy. Instead of seeking one big clash, medieval leaders often preferred raids, blocking crossings, burning crops, and taking small strong points to force the enemy into a corner. A set-piece battle often happened because one side finally had to accept it, not because both sides were eager for a fair fight. Number 2. Terrain picks the terms. The hidden rule is that medieval commanders fought the landscape as much as they fought the enemy. Flat open ground is great for dramatic charges on film, but real commanders looked for ground that made the other side's strengths awkward. If the enemy had better cavalry, you wanted mud, slopes, hedges, ditches, tight lanes, or woods that break up a charge and make horses bunch together. If the enemy had strong archers, you tried to deny them clear lines of sight, force them to shoot into wind, or make them fire over their own people. Even the sun mattered. If you can put glare in the enemy's eyes, or keep your own men in shade while they wait, that's an advantage you can actually feel. Arriving first also lets you rest, eat, and set your line while the enemy is still marching. This is why so many battles revolve around crossings and choke points. A bridge, a ford, or a causeway can neutralize numbers because only so many men can get through at once. Good commanders also anchored their line on obstacles so they couldn't be wrapped around easily. A flank protected by a swamp or a steep bank is a flank you don't need to guard with extra men. And medieval armies did prepare the ground when they had time.
Digging a shallow ditch, throwing up a low bank,
Placing stakes or lining wagons can turn an ordinary position into something that punishes a frontal attack. Once you notice this, a lot of famous outcomes look less like luck and more like planning. At Agincourt, the fighting space was narrow and the ground was heavy. At Bannockburn, the English had to advance through rough, constrained terrain. At Courtrai, mounted attacks ran into well-set infantry. The point isn't that terrain always decides the winner. It's that medieval leaders treated it like a weapon they could pick up and use. Number 3. Simple plans, limited control. Movies often treat medieval armies like one smooth machine. In reality, command and control were limited, so plans had to be simple, and units had to know what they were doing before the first contact. So the best armies drilled basic moves: hold, advance, pivot, and fall back in order. Once thousands of people are moving, shouting, and fighting, you can't rely on a single leader changing the plan on the fly. You communicated with banners, horns, drums, and messengers, and every one of those systems could fail. That's why armies were organized into blocks with their own leaders, often described as a vanguard, a main body, and a rear, or into a few large divisions that could hold their own if separated. Inside those blocks, smaller teams mattered too. A lance might mean a knight plus his close helpers and mounted support, and units often formed around who trained and traveled together, not around perfect uniformity. Commanders also cared about keeping a reserve. A reserve is not just a dramatic last attack, it's a repair tool. If your left side starts bending, a fresh unit can plug the gap or threaten the enemy flank and buy time. Another practical rule is that leaders needed to be seen. A banner upright and steady is a signal that a unit is still there and still organized. If that banner falls, even for an ordinary reason, like the bearer being hit or knocked down, people interpret it as disaster. Medieval commanders used that psychology. They guarded their own standards and tried to capture the enemy's, because symbols could move morale faster than any speech. This is also why perfect coordination between cavalry, infantry, and missiles is rare in real accounts. You could plan combined actions, but once the fight starts, the best you can often do is create pressure in the same general area and trust your sub-leaders to react. Winning often came down to which side kept some structure, while the other side's plan fell apart. Number 4. Formation beats solo fighting. One consistent pattern in real medieval combat is this: most people fought shoulder to shoulder, not as isolated duelists. A tight line of spears, bills, or pikes creates a threat zone that's hard to enter, and it also gives confidence. When you know your neighbors are covering you, you're more likely to hold your ground. That's why the hero runs ahead scene is mostly fantasy. A man who leaves the line becomes a single target, and a single target gets surrounded. The bread-and-butter weapon for ordinary soldiers was the spear in many regions and periods, because it's cheap, it reaches, and it works in a group. As armor improved, you see more two-handed pole weapons like bills, halberds, and poleaxes in the hands of professionals, because they can hook, push, and strike with force while still keeping distance. Shields mattered, but movies overused them. In some periods, many infantry carried shields. Later, as plate armor and two-handed weapons spread among better-equipped men, shields became less universal in the main line. Unit shape also mattered. Dense spear groups, like the Scottish schiltron or later pike blocks, could resist cavalry by presenting points in every direction, but they were vulnerable if they lost mobility or got flanked by missiles. Knights fit into this group logic too.
Yes, cavalry charges happened, but medieval cavalry worked best when it hit a weak angle or a shaken unit, not when it slammed straight into a well-set wall of points. Horses don't like crashing into a solid barrier, and good infantry can make that barrier real. That's why you often see knights dismount, especially on rough ground or in defensive battles. Dismounted men-at-arms could act as heavy infantry, stiffening the center and holding space while archers and lighter troops worked on the sides. Movies also miss how often commanders tried to keep people from chasing.
A unit that breaks formation to pursue a retreating enemy can turn into scattered groups, and scattered groups are easy to pick off by a fresh reserve. Discipline wasn't just nice to have, it was survival. Number 5. Armor changes the weapons. The sword is iconic, but on real battlefields it was often a secondary tool. Against armor, cutting is usually not the main answer. Mail resists slashes well, and good plate can shrug off most sword cuts. So fighters leaned on thrusting points, concentrated impact, and control. That's why you see maces, warhammers, axes, and pole arms everywhere in serious fighting. Even when a knight carried a sword, he might use it in a very different way than movies show. Gripping it shorter for better control, using the point like a short spear, or using the heavy parts of the hilt to strike when blades couldn't bite. And the targets were practical. Gaps in armor, joints, openings in the helmet, or a moment when the enemy is off balance. Grappling mattered because it helps you create those moments. If two armored men collide in a tight space, they may wrestle for position, try to throw each other, or pin an arm so a dagger can reach a weak spot. None of this looks elegant, but it matches the goal: make the other person lose control. Armor also changed pacing. Heavy kit traps heat, limits hearing, and narrows vision. You can be strong and trained and still gas out faster in full gear, especially if you've marched, stood for a long time, or fought in thick mud. That's why many commanders tried to make the enemy wait in armor or advance through bad ground before contact. It's also why the endless swinging you see on screen is misleading. Real fights often came in bursts: push, strike, reset, and breathe, while the line tries to stay connected. Cavalry has its own practical limits. Many war horses were not fully armored because horse armor is expensive and heavy, and even a trained horse needs space and confidence. The shock of a charge comes from speed, mass, and fear, but that only works when the target is already vulnerable or disordered. Number 6. Missiles shape behavior. Archers and crossbowmen were often there to create problems the enemy had to solve. A storm of arrows makes men raise shields, turn their bodies, close up their spacing, and hesitate. That hesitation matters. It can freeze a line long enough for your infantry to push, or it can stop cavalry from finding a clean run-up. Accuracy still mattered, but the bigger effect was pressure and disruption. Real missile warfare also has boring constraints that movies ignore. Another thing movies miss is scale. A handful of archers doesn't change much. You need lots of shooters acting together to create real pressure, and that takes organization. Longbowmen, for example, were valuable because years of practice let them shoot fast and keep a steady rhythm. But they still needed stacks of arrows and people whose only job was to move supplies forward. Crossbow units could be trained faster, but they relied on mechanical drawing tools and disciplined drill, so the line didn't fall apart while reloading. And target choice was usually practical. Shooters aimed into dense groups, at leaders near banners, or at horses and unshielded spots, because that's where a chance hit actually becomes a battlefield effect. Even when armor stops a shot, the impact and the fear it creates can still slow a line. That's the point. Ammunition is heavy and has to be moved forward. Bowstrings, especially natural fiber ones, don't love rain. Mud ruins footing and reduces how quickly you can shoot and relocate. Crossbows hit hard and can be deadly against good armor at the right range. But many types reload slowly, so crossbow units often used cover and teamwork. One line shoots while another reloads, sometimes behind large shields called pavises. Archers also needed protection, because missile troops are vulnerable if caught in the open. That's why you see them on the wings, behind stakes, beside rough ground, or screened by men-at-arms.
Later medieval battles add another layer that films either exaggerate or ignore. Early gunpowder weapons. Early handguns and small cannons were not always accurate, but they brought noise, smoke, and psychological effect, and they could punch through armor at closer ranges. They also pushed armies to think more about cover and prepared positions. The practical reality is that missile troops were part of a system. They were strongest when a solid front line could hold the enemy in place long enough for missiles to matter, and when terrain kept the missile troops from being easily overrun.
Number 7. Morale ends most battles. Medieval combat is often less about total destruction and more about breaking the enemy's will to keep fighting. People can stand in a line under pressure for only so long before fear, exhaustion, and confusion start doing their work. Once a unit begins to fall back, gaps open, and gaps are contagious. Nearby units see movement, assume something terrible happened, and start drifting too. That's how a stable line can turn into a collapse faster than you'd expect. This also explains a pattern that historians mention again and again. Many of the worst losses happen after the decision point, when one side is running and the other is chasing. That's when discipline matters most, because pursuit can turn you into scattered groups, and scattered groups can get ambushed or counterattacked. Another rule movies usually skip is the economics of capture. A wealthy knight or noble could be worth more alive than dead because ransom money and political leverage were real prizes. That shaped behavior. Men tried to identify important opponents by armor and heraldry, and sometimes a hard fight turns into a controlled surrender because both sides know the financial logic. But it wasn't equal for everyone. Social rank often decided who could expect ransom and who could be treated as just another ordinary soldier. Battles also had rules in the sense of custom and negotiation. Heralds might carry messages, truces could be arranged to talk or to handle practical needs, and commanders sometimes tried to settle things with positioning and pressure before committing to a full collision. After the fighting, a commander still had to manage the army as a living thing. Regroup units, secure the camp, guard prisoners, keep scouts out, and make sure the enemy can't rally nearby. A victory on the field didn't automatically end a war.
The strategic goals were usually concrete and political, forcing a treaty, weakening a rival's alliances, proving control of a region, or opening the way to a key town. That's why medieval leaders so often chose sieges, raids, and maneuver instead of gambling everything on one battle, and why the glorious clash was often the exception, not the default.